Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Ask the Experts webinar. Our topic for discussion today will be working with parents. And I'm going to be your facilitator for today. I'm Dr. Jamison Merrill. Very excited to be here with our lovely panel of experts. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's our agenda for today. So we'll start with a quick introduction from each of our speakers. Then we're going to go into answering some of your questions and wrap up with some final thoughts at the end. Our first expert with us today is Katie Malinsky. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little about your practice?
Sure. I am a licensed clinical social worker in Austin, Texas, and I am in private practice and have been for a while, and I specialize in working with parents on parenting. And I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. Our next expert is Amanda Zaidman. Amanda, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little about your work?
Yeah, so my name is Amanda. I'm a child therapist and parenting expert in Charlotte, North Carolina. My practice is called Constructive Parenting, and in my practice, I specialize in working both with parents and also with children. For some families, it's only parenting work. For other families, it's a combination of the two.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. And our last expert on the panel is Dr. Shana Alvarez. Shana, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little about your practice?
Absolutely. I'm Shana Alvarez, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I work with families, predominantly families of children with big feelings and intense behaviors. I also provide training. I'm a clinical supervisor at the University of Washington and Seattle Pacific University, and I practice kind of in between, particularly during the pandemic. I'm in Seattle part-time and in White Rock, Canada part-time.
Thank you all so much for being here. So now we're going to go ahead and jump into all of your questions. So our first question for today is, if we are just getting started with this work, what would you recommend as our first step? So for those clinicians just delving into this field of work, what advice would you have? I'll have Amanda answer this one first, and then Shana, and then Katie.
So I think speaking specifically to delving into parenting work, I think if this is the work that you're interested in, it's important to maybe do a little research. There's so many different parenting models out there. Pick one that you feel like maybe applies to your values and the work that you want to do and study in that, and that'll give you a foundation. I think that so many of the different parenting models have overlap, and so that it's possible to get started and then create your practice. And then from there, you can supplement. There's always more trainings. There's always more knowledge to learn. But I think having a foundation and working with parents, working with children, is the best place to start.
Yeah, I would build on to that actually. Similarly, I would refer to evidence-based parenting interventions to build your foundation, right? So if you go to California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, or really any evidence-based clearinghouse, you can see which parenting interventions have been most rigorously studied. And I would seek out training specifically in one of those parenting interventions. And as Amanda said, there is quite a bit of overlap, at least in the most rigorously studied parenting interventions. Once you have evidence-based parenting interventions as your foundation, you can always, add more trainings from there, seek out some up-and-coming perspectives and tools. But if you have that foundation, I think parents are going to feel more confident in coming to you. You're going to feel more confident as a clinician, and then that relationship between parent and therapist is going to be enhanced because of that trust they have, that you have that training there. I would also add one more thing, just gaining an understanding of really not just what the intervention is, but the impact on parent mental health when you have a kiddo that might be challenged, having challenging behaviors, or maybe has a chronic emotional behavioral diagnosis. So that we don't just get stuck in, I want to reduce this behavior, I want to reduce that behavior, but we're really seeing the whole family system. And we are recognizing that parent mental health is the foundation of family mental health.
Love those answers. And I would just add briefly to get some experience with a broad range of children outside of clinical practice. So volunteer in a preschool, have your own children, play with your nieces and nephews. There's actually a lot of really obnoxious, difficult to parent behavior that is completely normal. And it's really helpful to be able to tell the difference between the normal problematic behaviors that just have everything to do with the kid's age and the ones that might have a clinical focus. And so broadening your experience with all kinds of kids and all different settings at all different ages is incredibly useful.
Really great recommendations from everyone on how to start building a foundation in this work. And building on that, our next question is, how would each of the panelists recommend marketing towards this community? Certain things to put on a website, social media, a directory. So you're kind of ready to start doing this work. How can you attract those potential clients? I'll have Katie answer this one first, and then Amanda, and then Shauna.
I think the thing that has been most helpful to me over the years is putting myself in front of groups of parents. I started out doing kid and family therapy in private practice and got invited to speak like at schools in front of the PTA or booster clubs. And it has turned out to be a really wonderful way to connect with people who might be interested in your services at some point. And what I have found is that, especially if you take a handout with your name and your contact information on it, put something useful on it, people might save that, and they save it as much to remember you as they did to remember what you said. Because when you give a talk, when people get a little sample of you, you may not know it, but you're actually sort of pre-interviewing for the job of their therapist or their parent coach or their helper. People are so much happier reaching out to services to someone that they have had some teeny tiny interaction with than just strangers on a list. So one of my favorite pieces of advice then is to see if you can get yourself out there in front of people so that they can kind of sample who you are and how you are.
So true.
I would say, to add to that, I have found just having a presence on the internet, really looking at creating a website that ranks high in Google, making sure that you're searchable. And so that really means thinking about what is your, your ideal clients, like what are they going to be typing into Google, and you do that, and you need to make sure that you're showing up. So either hiring someone to manage your website, or if you do it yourself, using something like Yoast SEO or whatever, and capturing those keywords. So, making sure, even if you have specialties within parenting, that each one of those has a page. And then when you're looking at making sure that it's searchable, that you're putting those keywords as well as your location. So again, when people are typing in, that you're ranking high. I think initially too, you got to think about, it takes about 6 weeks for Google to be able to capture what you create on your website. So if you're looking to build quicker than that, thinking about Google AdWords or paying for something like that can be worthwhile, so that you're ranking really high initially. And then I would also say, thinking about social media, because I know that was one of the questions on there, that can be a full-time job. So really considering, is that something that you enjoy? Is it something you're passionate about? You can create a lot of great content and put it out there. But with that said, it is just time consuming. So that could be something that you hire out, or even just put on hold and focus on other areas like in-person work, like Katie mentioned.
Yeah, great tips. I think it depends on your situation a little bit, right? If you already have sought out kind of the initial training, just getting started, or not. I would say the first step, if you've gotten that training, so that you have that foundation of tools that parents can trust, then I would actually say just to put everything, like if you're going to run a group, put everything into that first group. I mean, it was the front loading of the work was so much, and it was so intense, but it was so worth it, because then every group after that got smoother and smoother, and that work paid off, right? We didn't have to recreate the wheel every time. We sought out intensive supervision from our mentors in our first group. So for our mentors were Jamila Reed and Carolyn Webster Stratton, who are the creators of the Incredible Years program. And they came and watched our groups, they watched our tapes, they participated in our groups, so that we really had front loaded all of this work. And so that first year was exhausting. But then what happened is we didn't really need to advertise, because we had put so much work into that group, that the word of mouth, like you were saying, Katie, it really spreads, right? Somebody asked you to come to the PTA. Somebody, we actually had an owner of a small business say, I'm going to offer this as a benefit to all my employees. like I want them to, right? And that starts happening. Like your product speaks for itself. And that I think is a really great way to start. And then once you have that, the clinical work, and you've put all that work in and the community trusts you, then from there, that's after we had done that for years, that's when we started to branch out and think about, social media. And we just started doing that during COVID, actually, to get more to the everyday parent. But I would focus on, quality assurance for your product first and gaining the trust of your community.
Yeah.
Great suggestions from everybody. And our next question is how to set appropriate boundaries with parents in order to protect rapport and confidentiality with children. So I imagine this could be a challenge that comes up a fair amount in this work. So would love to hear your perspective, starting with Amanda and then Katie.
I think when I work with children, I always sit down in an initial session with both child and parent present, and kind of address this issue up front. And I will tell children that I'm working with, and I will say that the majority of the kids I see are elementary school aged. But I will tell them up front that what we say in session, I'm not going to bring any of that information directly to your parents. I'm not going to say first she said this and then she said that ever to your parents. I will tell them about the exceptions. I will say, unless there's a safety concern, in which case I will go and get your parents and we'll decide how to tell them. I will also bring up if there are concerns around things that are not safety related, but I feel like it's really important for mom or dad to know that I will, ask them, let's make a plan. When does it feel right to tell them? If it's not okay to tell them today, let's think about how we're going to tell them in the next few weeks or so, this important piece of information. And then I'll tell kids that they don't need to keep anything a secret, that they can leave a session and they can tell parents everything, whatever they want to say is fine. And then I will encourage parents, because they're both sitting there, not to bug their kids, right? So it's okay to check in here and there, but to not pester, because that can really undermine the work that we're doing. So yeah, that's usually how I handle that piece.
I think Amanda said it perfectly. I don't really have much to add.
All right, great answers. All right, so for this one, what is your go-to book that you recommend to parents? So Shauna, I'll let you answer this one first, and then Katie, and then Amanda.
Sure. Hands down, the first is The Incredible Years, a troubleshooting guide for parents of children aged 3 to 8, the newest version of the book. It's evidence-based, it's parent-friendly, and it's really consistent with, if you are going to seek out training in an evidence-based intervention, as we talked about, they all have common components. So even if the order in which you're going through the tools may be different depending on the program you're doing, the tools will still apply because the common components overlap so much between these evidence-based interventions. The second would be, I think The Incredible Years does a great job of really addressing more of the environmental modifications, the changes in parent behaviors, the parenting strategies and tools. I think some of the internal work that we need to get to, something that can be paired nicely, is parenting with ACT, and ACT stands for Acceptance Commitment Therapy. And this goes to, I think particularly if you're working with parents of children that might have more chronic challenges, or parents who have anxiety or depression themselves, some of those approaches can be embedded really nicely in how to find some inner peace while you are in the storm with your child.
Sorry, am I next? I guess I forgot the order.
I think so.
Go for it.
My favorite parenting book has always been The Whole Brain Child. It's by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. It's a wonderful book. They've actually got a bunch. But I will also say that I actually just wrote a book. It's called How to Talk to Your Teen About Anything. And so I don't think I should mention that. So now I have 2 favorite parenting books.
I would say, building on that, I love No Drama Discipline, also by Daniel Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. I have found in reading both of those and recommending them, sometimes parents find No Drama Discipline just a little bit more accessible, whereas clinicians can really dig into Whole Brain Child a little bit more. I would say the second favorite would be Simplicity Parenting by Kim Payne. And that book really, that digs into really looking at the environment, looking at the home, looking at what sorts of things do we need to pare down in order to simplify and in order to get to the root of what's most important to a family.
All right, I've definitely got some books to add to my resources list and check out. Our next question.
Can I say something?
Oh, please.
Sorry, I apologize. My book isn't out yet. Sorry, I realized I said I had a book, and I do. It's right here, but it's an advanced copy. It's on sale in January.
Excellent. Something great to look forward to. All right, and our next question is, what does a typical parenting session look like for you? So I'm sure, of course, a lot of different modalities and approaches, and just clinician to clinician, everyone is going to approach this a little differently. So would love to hear from each of you, starting with Katie, and then Shauna, and then Amanda.
The work that I do is just with the parents on parenting, and I don't meet their kids. So I think each one of us has got different ways that we structure things. The first session, I'm more likely to take a history and to talk about goals and problems, and not do quite as much digging in. But from that point forward, the process is I actually ask parents to record some data for me about difficult incidences. So they'll like come back and tell me a story of last Thursday at dinner time when my kid was tantruming and wouldn't come to the table, and then I said this and they said this. And what I'm trying to do is to get parents, it's really a twofold, but I want them to collect data so that I can kind of be a fly on the wall and see what's happening in their difficult interactions. But it's also a little sneaky intervention, because the part of your brain that collects data and pays attention to things and is tracking what's happening is not the same part of your brain that has threat response. So if I can get the parents to kind of tune into the, like, let's pay attention to what's happening, like I said, it's a little sneaky intervention. And so then they'll tell me the story, and we'll work together to increase insight about what's going on there. Like, we'll create a working theory about what was going on for the kid, what was the trigger, what are the ways that the parent interacted with the child that either helped or didn't help, and what could they do different. And then we rinse and repeat. There's a lot of transferable skills from one incident to another. And after a little while, people start to see the patterns, and then they start to recognize them themselves. So that's what sessions look like for me.
Yeah, I will build on that. And I like that you separated the intake process first. I didn't think about that. So yeah, our intake typically involves, we work with both children and parents. The children have therapy, and then the parents have therapy, and then the parent-child therapist meet every week, and sometimes we work together. And so we used to do a live parent-child interaction that was coded, but now we do a recorded parent-child interaction, a 10-minute play sample, and we record some data there. We have the parents fill out some standardized questionnaires. And then we have two parent intake sessions. The first is really focused on the parents themselves, their own mental health and their parenting histories, because that's actually not part of, of the Incredible Years program per se, but it came up over and over in clinical practice as something that you're going to bump into anyway. Mm-hmm. And I think it builds some great empathy for, rather than saying, oh, that's a resistant parent, or, you say like, oh no, it's hard to set a limit when you had really harsh parenting practices growing up. And the idea of seeing your child in any distress is really impacting you. So it's going to change how you view the parent behavior. So we spend the first session doing that, and it also gets you really seeing the parents, like, hey, let's just put it all out there. Let's all be authentic. What are your ugly parenting thoughts? What was it like for you as a kid, And we also, in the second session, we dive more into identifying values and goals. And so that's when we make the treatment plan together and identify the specific goals. Then once we start in the sessions, we follow like a kind of the order of evidence-based parenting interventions in general, right? Starting with all prevention and relationship building tools, and then working your way up to more structured interventions. So it'll start with a review of what the child's learning in therapy, and then we collaboratively set the agenda. We check in on how homework went. We do some troubleshooting and role play and video modeling. And then if the parent is ready, we'll introduce the next tool to their toolbox. But sometimes, especially right now, I would say, when you're collaboratively writing that agenda, things slow down and you're addressing parent mental health and parent well-being, and that's okay. Part of it.
Yeah. So thinking about those two pieces, I guess, for intake with parents, I will send parents ahead of time through SimplePractice an intake questionnaire, and I'll have them fill that out ahead of time, and I'll read it. And so in that first session, we're really going through those pieces, looking at the history of the family, looking at what the family's values are, looking at the history of the problem and what's going on, the presenting problem with their child. We'll come up with goals in that session. And then I will always usually do a genogram with a family if there's time, really looking at patterns, really looking for, okay, this is what's going on here. And now we're looking back a little bit further. I will ask families as they're doing their genograms, and then we're kind of going through their own history, just what are the best things that they got from the family of origin, the things that they want to pass down, and what are the things that they want to change that, you get a chance to do it differently. Your parents did the best that they could, and now you get to pick. So I'll do that for each side. And then when I will always in the first session go over regulation, co-regulation, dysregulation, just basically the way that the brain responds to stress. More typical, every once a week sessions, those look like they're 45 minutes long. And it's sort of a similar pattern to what Katie was talking about. I have a form that I use for parents to track behaviors, just looking for patterns, looking for the ways that children are behaving, the way that parents are interacting and that they're responding. Look at the antecedent to the behavior itself, and the maintaining consequence. And we'll go through piece by piece. And as we do that organically, different parenting strategies will come up. I'll listen and validate to what's happening. And then on the other hand, I will say, are you open to a little feedback here? Can we dig in? It's different. I think parents are very much able to recognize when we're together in session and we're calm and our lids are all the way down and we're fully regulated, it's easy, right, to talk about what do we want to do differently, and it's opportunity to do that. But I will always validate. In the moment, I completely get it. It's really hard, right, to remain grounded. And so we use that time to do that. And then usually there's some other parenting strategy that I'm looking at teaching them. So if there's time after going through that ABC chart, then I'm adding a little bit of psychoeducation about new content.
Absolutely. And moving into our next question. So we've all had to make some adjustments to the way that we work due to the pandemic. So how has the pandemic / having to have sessions on Zoom affected the panelists' work with their parent clients? So how has this changed the way that you work, and how has this affected your approach? And I will have Shauna answer this first, and then Amanda, and then Katie.
I'll start with a benefit, actually. I was really worried at first. I am an extrovert. I like connection. I like being in person and feeling people. And so I was concerned, but the benefits of accessibility have been huge. I have had so many parents say, we've known we needed to do something for a long time, but we never could. And now I've got, if there's two parents, one's opening at the office, one maybe is opening from the car in a parking lot, and they sign in, they sign out. They're not having to use paid time off, deal with traffic, park, go back to work. It's huge. And that same way, I'm also having far less requests for one lead parent to participate and then play telephone and translate the information to the other parent, which I 99% of the time said no to anyway. If there are more than one parent, I really, really find a way to make them both involved. But now I don't, if there's two, they're both there, and sometimes grandparents, which is great. So accessibility has been huge. Call me from a janitor's closet. I don't care. We will make it work. And then I would say that second on the tricky part is, there's a lot more parent mental health stuff. There's always parent mental health stuff, but there's a lot more. Parents are not okay. Parents are not okay right now. And so I think the intake process was always emotional, but it's more emotional now. And I'm even more glad to do that work up front, because I think then the parents feel okay being vulnerable and just falling apart from time to time. And there's room for that. There's room for that. So yeah, I think just knowing that burnout is putting it lightly. It's tough out there. Yeah.
Good answer. Pre-pandemic, I offered virtual sessions for parents, which was helpful moving into pandemic because I was familiar with that platform. I would say now that we're in pandemic and maybe moving out a little bit, I save my office sessions for children, and I do parenting work online still. I would say all those benefits that Shauna mentioned are very real. I think for me, one of the best parts is being able to schedule parents during their lunch breaks, being able to see parents from all over the state, not just locally where I am. But being able to offer that to parents, the virtual piece just makes that so much easier. I will offer to do an intake session in person, because I think it sometimes it really does mean a lot to do, to be able to meet one-on-one and to build that trust. But I will say I've done work with parents in both ways, and I haven't really seen a big downfall from doing it virtually. I've seen equally effective work in both scenarios.
Like Amanda, I offered teletherapy before the pandemic and was so grateful that I had worked out some of the kinks when I had to move my entire practice online. And what I feel like there's different parts to this question. The technology part of it, I feel like has been helpful to my practice. So I was already online, but none of my, not none, very few clients wanted to try teletherapy. And then the whole world got shoved into it. And now everybody has figured it out. And I feel like that it is going to be a part of my practice forever. And I think a much larger proportion of my practice is going to be virtual forever. I've even changed like how I manage my office because of that. So I appreciate that. And also, like Shauna, I think I have seen more participation and it is easier. And I think people love not having to drive across town to come to my office. It's been, that accessibility piece has been wonderful. The other piece of the question is, has the pandemic affected how I work with my parents? And I guess I just wanted to, I'm partially echoing that parents are not all right, but also just to say it's been so hard on everybody, so hard, that I have felt there's this real thread of having compassion for self and having compassion and patience for child. That I always have preached that, but I felt like it has had to be a much more obvious and loud and frequent focus, because everybody is not at their best self. And we can see it in our kids and their behaviors, and we can see it in ourselves and how we parent. And especially because here it is a year and a half into it, we feel like we should be over it. And yet for some people, there's a delayed reaction, I think, to some of the stresses of the last year and a half. And so just really, really, really feeling like there's a need for compassion and I guess patience is the best word I have for it, about how hard this has been for everybody and how much we have been impacted.
Yeah, great points. It's really something that's been so difficult for all of us, but it's really encouraging to hear that there has been a silver lining in some regards, particularly around that accessibility piece and being able to have that participation in a new and more inclusive way. And our next question. It looks like we don't have the slide for that one up just yet. Oh, there we go. So our next question is how to best work with couples who have different styles of parenting or different styles of working with their children. So Amanda, if you want to answer this one first, and then Shauna, and then Katie.
As part of my intake that I send parents, I have them look at this ridiculously long list of positive traits. And I have them choose 5 that feels the most important to them. And I have them think about that as, what are the traits or the qualities you want your kid to possess as they become adults? And I use that as the foundation of all the work that I do with parents. And so in this circumstance, when parents really are coming at doing it differently, we come back to that, to those values. And as long as I have overlap there, I'm able to work with and guide parents. And so we can look at strengths, we can look at differences, we can make space for a parent who feels like she's doing it wrong or he's doing wrong, hearing what's underneath that and moving back towards, ultimately you guys have the same goals in mind. And so there's times when it makes sense for a parent A to step in and parent B just to sit tight a little bit and then flip, because both parents are bringing important things to the parenting dynamic.
Yes, I love what you said about values. I would echo that. I think, again, making sure you have a solid intake process that starts there, that gets people on the same page, because sometimes there's been years and years of disagreement about how to get to their goals, that they haven't really revisited the fact that, like, oh yeah, I did choose someone that shares my values and goals. Once you stop yelling at each other for doing it wrong. So if you can back up and start with common values, I tend to use like an acceptance commitment therapy frame about values. And I explain, values aren't exactly how we're going to get there. Values are the compass, right? Like, what's your due north in parenting, right? Like, the details might differ, but at least you're both heading due north. Yeah. And then from there, identifying what the goals are and having them set that together. Usually that actually starts to bring people together, because those things they have more in common. They just have a different interpretation of how to get there, because they're two different humans raised by two different families and two different cultures, right? And it all makes sense. And validating all that, like, this is a crazy endeavor, right? It's two totally different humans raising a human. That's nuts. And so I think having that common ground can really be helpful. Yes, I only use evidence-based interventions, and the path up that mountain is going to look different for each family, right? And then I think by having them go through that process together in the beginning of the intake process of reflecting on their own histories, that can be actually really powerful, because, and they're not allowed to interject as they share, because it can build some empathy. And if you start with empathy, that changes how they're going to approach the whole journey together, right? Like, oh, right, I forgot that was your experience when you were a kid. Oh, right, like, that's why you seem so controlling. You don't want this to fall off the wheels, right? And then everybody kind of exhales and holds hands and is like, okay, here we go. And then from there, it's this reminder of, hey, come to me now. You don't have to control each other anymore. Bring it up with me. Bring it up with me. I can be the bad guy, and your guys' job is not to regulate each other's parenting behaviors anymore. Let me do that.
Right in line with what Shauna just said, I actually have a couple of almost prosaic or trivial techniques that I use with parents. And so this is not so much big picture, but just a very tiny. I often tell parents when this comes up that I've never in my life met any two people parenting together who agreed on all the things, right? Like, it's impossible to have two parents who are going to agree on all the parenting decisions. And I've noticed that sometimes people kind of relax into that because they feel like there's something wrong with them, that they and their partner don't agree on parenting. So we just start with, like, of course you don't agree. Another thing that I do with parents is I talk about how sometimes they push each other to the poles. And I'll say, like, you feel like it should go this way, and you feel like it should go this way, but when you see her doing it that way, you do it even more your way. And that, I think, is a concept that people can chew on really easily and recognize that maybe they aren't even, like, they are doing it more strict than they even mean to, and that can help them come together. And then the last piece is, I often say, the truth is going to be somewhere right down the middle of the two of you, because since they are the two parents, the best we'll get is a compromise, right? Like, it's going to be a combination of the way they do things, but like Shauna said, which I love, also with a little bit of me in it as well. And so we say, we're just going to chart a path down the middle, and somehow that seems to help.
Thank you all for your answers. Moving on to our next question. What are the best consistent practices parents can do to reduce their own stress in the home? So Katie, I'll let you answer this one first, and then Shauna, and then Amanda.
When I talk about this with the parents, I tend to start out by saying, this is something that you don't need me to tell you, but gosh, you have to be well to parent well. And I encourage them to think about things that have already worked for them. So if a parent already has a practice that they used to do to take care of themselves, I feel like we'll get more mileage out of reinstating it than we will if I try to shift them. So I tend to start with whatever it is they've already done that works, and see if we can encourage them, support them, schedule them, support each other to get it done.
Now I forgot. Am I next? Sorry. I was so intently listening, Katie. I was captivated. Okay, let's see. I would say particularly right now, I mean, with social media in general, but especially during the pandemic, I ask what their current intake of parenting information is. And we talk about that. And if that is feeding them or paralyzing them. And I would say 95% of the time, it is paralyzing and causing a level of parenting anxiety that is super unhealthy and not helpful. So we start off saying, I'm like, okay, you are in this program that has been researched, right? This is going to be hard work. And I start off that way. I'm like, it's going to be boot camp. Let's go. And so you're doing a lot already. Those extra blogs and scroll and 5 parenting books that don't have to be peer reviewed in order to be, no, sorry, or the any social media stuff. If it's feeding you, awesome. If it's I know I love reading psychology books before bed. It feeds me, great. But if it's not, let go of some of that noise. What can we let go of, right? Who are you outside of being a parent, right? Because you're already doing this, and this is a lot of parenting work. Right? So what else? Who are you outside of this? What are your values outside of this? And then lastly, one of the reasons I love data is that it allows parents to remember where they came from, right? Like improvement for them, their journey is not going to look like their neighbor's journey or some family on Instagram's journey or whatever. And so, but if you look back at that initial data and you go, wow, my kid used to punch me 5 times a week and now he screams, I hate you. Are you living the parenting kumbaya dream? No, but dang, are things going in the right direction? Yes, they are. And so I think that feeds parent mental health, right? Anytime parents start to vibrate and go like, oh my God, I revisit where we started, and that grounds us again.
I think I had mentioned in one of the books that I will recommend to parents, is Simplicity Parenting by Kim Payne. And some of the concepts mentioned there I think are the same things that I visit when I'm feeling like a system is really stressed and that we really need to start there. That looks like increasing structure, making sure that there's a really consistent routine in place, creating family rituals like dinners together or eating breakfast together or brunch on Sundays or whatever works for a family. Simplifying schedules, that's a big deal. We saw, the benefit of that when COVID was at its peak. And I was really careful with parents to really acknowledge as we start introducing, let's be careful, let's notice what happens to the system and how many things feels like too much. When things feel like too much, I will work with parents to consider stepping back, like cutting out an after school activity here or there, maybe cutting back on all of them and then slowly reintroducing after things have kind of leveled off. And then I will also work with parents on, creating their own mindfulness practice, helping them understand what it is and supporting them on that journey if that's something that they're willing to do. And also certainly supporting kids with that piece as well. So when I'm working with both parents and child, we will do that in session, and then I'll have parents follow through with working on breathing exercises or mindful listening or just other coping strategies that are related to mindfulness. One other piece that I miss thinking about Kim Payne's work is also just simplifying our things. So looking at a playroom, and if it's completely, got 1,000,001 things, which most playrooms do, really cutting it in half and then cutting it in half again so that only the favorite things are left and the children, really come back to the toys that they value. And then same for parents, looking around their space and considering how that reflects where they are in the inside, what does it look like in their space around them? So kind of simplifying that as well.
I want that book, Amanda. I haven't read it.
Great answers. And moving into our next question, how to build trust with parents and get parent buy-in for kids to continue therapy. So when the children are our clients, but we need the parents to be the ones who are actually bringing their children to these sessions, setting them up, paying for them. How do we get that buy-in? So I'll turn this over to you first, Amanda, and then Shauna.
I think I mentioned all the work that I do with families begins with parents. So that, always is a 90-minute intake. And then usually I see parents for at least 3 sessions before I'll work with the child, unless the child's in crisis. And typically those aren't the kids I'm working with. So in those sessions, I'm really working to make space and hold what is it that the family's struggling with, and I'm creating a relationship with parents. I think that foundation is so important. Just validating, normalizing, really just making room for parents to vent about what's going on. With kids, typically it's, a similar process of just getting to know them, and I don't see a lot of pushback from kids around therapy, but when I do, I will bring to them, I'll bring them back to the goals. What are the things that we identified that are important? What's getting in the way of you having fun with your friends, or succeeding in school, or having a good relationship with your parents? And we'll talk about, when it looks like we're successful in each of those places, that's when you get to be done. So if you can hunker down and really focus on these things with me over the next few weeks, we will check back in, and we can see if we can go to bi-weekly. And then if we can continue to do that, we'll be finished. And that sort of puts the ball back in their court. It isn't, no, someone's making you come. It's, I get to control how much I participate, how much I put into this, and then how quickly I get through reaching our goals.
I mean, I want to echo so much of that. Over 70% of the outcomes in working with young children is in working with parents, right? So I have that in my intake forms, that I don't work with children without parent involvement. And in fact, it's parent heavy. And we might, after parents have a full toolbox, then we might move to check-in, and the child might keep going in sessions, right, to have a place to practice these skills and a safe place to talk about things continually. Although mostly when the parents graduate, the children are graduating as well, because now the environment is set up to actually provide a lot of those supports themselves. But for a bulk of our kids, and the research supports that, right, for about a third of the kids, they do go on to continue to need some ongoing supports themselves, even after the parenting intervention has taken place. So that is to say that, I usually don't need to get a lot of parent buy-in for the kid to keep coming, because if they have started down the path with me or in this work, they already see that they are the foundation of everything. And that is kind of what the first, in the first psychoeducation and setting goals and all of that, and sharing with them, what we know about what works for spicy kids particularly, then they get it. We're starting off on the same page. Yeah, so I think we start off that way. So there's not really a need for that conversation as much later. They know that they are everything.
Excellent. And then our final question will be, how do we best help our parents, clients understand their children's tantrums instead of just reacting? So Katie, I'll let you answer this one first, and then Amanda, and then Shauna.
Lots of ways, and I have one that I wanted to share, and I think SimplePractice can send this out. It's an infographic that that I created a while back, and it's called the Arc of the Tantrum. And the idea is, I tell parents, imagine that you could chart a tantrum on a graph. So the y-axis is level of tantrum, and the x-axis is time. And you know what? Tantrums, they kind of look like a bell curve. So at first there's no tantrum, then there's a trigger, then we have escalation, then we get to dysregulation, then they start to calm down, and then they get back to normal. And then I tell the parents, there are tools that work better depending on which of the stages of the tantrum that you're in. And we also talk about how most parents are most motivated to intervene for behavior up here when things are at their worst. And then I say, guess which is the least effective moment to intervene with the behavior? And and every 100% of people go, yeah, like it's almost intuitive that they know this, but then we're all compelled to address it when things are worse. And so there's been something that has just really worked for parents about this, I think. I think it's the visual. And again, it's that little sneaky intervention of getting them to start to collect data. So I'll tell them, look, figure out what your kids' signals are when they're in pre-trigger vulnerability. What do they look like when they're escalating? How can you see it in their body? Is your kids, what do they do when they're dysregulated? And so I'll have them like collect the data, like legit on paper, but also just to intuitively get better at being able to think about where their kid is in the process. And then on the flip side, I always tell them there's these 5 columns. Each of the columns is a list of interventions that fits with that stage. Anyway, I could talk about this forever, and I'm trying to be fast. But if anybody finds that remotely interesting, it's available for free. And I think SimplePractice can send it to you. And if the visual helps the parents that you work with, please.
I usually talk about regulation and dysregulation and basically tantrums in an initial session, in that first session, because I feel like parents are showing up in a place where they really want some sort of, they want to take away at least something, some sort of understanding about why is this happening and what can I do. And I usually always go over Daniel Siegel's hand-brain model, so I can go through that if you guys want. It's basically if you make a fist with your hand, and actually I've got a little angry hand right now because the kid yesterday drew an angry hand as we were talking about this, but if I make a fist with my thumb on the inside, right here at the base where my wrist is, that represents the brainstem, which is just right behind my ponytail. And that is in charge of all the things that our brain does in order to keep us alive that we don't have to think about. Things like our heart rate, our body temperature, balance, blinking, things like that. In the center of our brain is where the amygdala is. And I will also talk about the hippocampus, but to keep this brief, the amygdala is that small almond-shaped part of the brain that's really heavily connected with our emotional reactions. And I teach parents to think about the amygdala almost like a guard on a watchtower, just always scanning the environment, looking for anything dangerous and also anything different. And then the fingers would be the neocortex. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is right here, which is right behind my forehead. The prefrontal cortex is a smart part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that allows us to dream and create, but also allows us to slow down and stop and think before we act. So I teach parents that this is a regulated brain and this is a dysregulated brain, right? And so what happens is this prefrontal cortex, which by the way isn't fully formed until we're 25 years old, when it's all working smoothly, we're able to notice what's going on and to react and to stop and think about what we do before we act. But when that amygdala notices anything dangerous, so that might have been a tiger or a warring tribe, or it could be just a mommy saying no, what happens is that we flip our lids, and of course our brains stay together, but what it means is the majority of the blood rushes down into the brainstem and we enter fight or flight. And we're in survival mode at that point. So I help parents also really recognize, it seems like when kids hit around 3 years old, they're able to walk, they're able to talk, especially those really verbal kids or those big kids, they have it even worse. We expect them to behave like little adults and to just have a regulated brain at all times. And then I help parents remember, even well past the age of 25, at my age, at your age, we flip our lids all the time, right? And so that gives them a little bit more compassion just towards their children about what's going on. And then we talk about when to intervene. So kind of what Katie was saying, when I'm like this, I can't reach the smart part of the brain. The best time to intervene, and this takes really paying attention to your children, knowing their patterns, but is to notice when their lid is just starting to go up a little bit. And when it's right there, that's when we can co-regulate. And co-regulation is when we have our own brain nice and calm. We recognize I'm starting to get triggered. I ground my own nervous system, and then I share that calm with my child. They can go from here to here. If it reaches here, we're just sort of playing a waiting game. We're doing our own breathing. I talk about doing like a Care Bear stare of just like sending out calm energy to your child, helping to get their lid down a little bit quicker. And once that lid comes down, we can teach them again because they're teachable when they're regulated. But that little framework, I use that consistently throughout each of my parenting sessions, each of my sessions with the kids that I work with, just helping them to really recognize their own pattern, kind of that same arc that Katie was describing.
Yes, I want to fist bump to all the things. So yeah, I think I get it the same, that same message we cover as well. I would say in the very beginning, when we're talking about what we know from evidence-based practice, is that, the bulk of the work, we conceptualize it in our clinic as like a parenting tree, and that at the bottom, the roots are the parent-child relationship, and then there's teaching new skills and increasing structure, and then kind of discipline and how you respond to a challenging behavior in the moment, like right at the top. And we always start down here, and that's the bulk of the work. So I think when parents enter therapy, kind of flipping around that frame of actually most of the work we're going to be doing is what you do outside of these super flipped lid, as you discussed, moments. And then by the time we get up here to the top of the tree, you're going to find you actually, depending on the kid, but you're not going to need to use those strategies as often, because we did so much skill building when the child was regulated or just slightly dysregulated. I think a lot of parents right now have this misconception, because maybe a variety of reasons, but I would say social media is part of it, that, if they emotion coach just right, and if they are sweet and positive enough all the time, that, they can see the right words and they're going to be like, I see you, I hear you, and the child's screaming, and then all of a sudden they're going to hug and say kumbaya. And it's not, and then they feel like failures. Once a kid's brain is on fire, sometimes you have to ride the wave and wait. You got, the arc of the tantrum thing, like you said, Katie. And then the other thing I think that we talk about quite a bit is we talk a lot about the modeling principle throughout. So for every tool that we are having a parent use with the child, we also have them log, using it on themselves each week. And so the modeling principle is huge. And so if what we're working on with children is the frontal lobe, which is kind of the pause button in the brain as well, right? Like instead of going straight to reacting, we actually have to start with demonstrating an exaggerated pause. Right? And that can kind of get a little bit at like, oh, I'm doing this for this concrete reason, like the parents that kind of think more that way, where they are pausing instead of reacting. Why? Because your kid needs to see you pause. And we can get into all the reasons as well, right? But like in that moment, imagine an ellipses, right? And you're just waiting and pausing before you react. And so much wisdom can happen in that time. Because we can't ask our kids to like, hey, slow down, take a breath, man. Like it's not a big problem when we're not doing it ourselves either. Oh, Jameson, we can't hear you.
I can't hear you.
Apologies. So was just saying great answers, everybody. And we actually have one final question here today before we move into our final thoughts section, which is, what is the impact of the sheer amount and quality of parenting information parents now have access to? How does this impact your work in supporting families? So I will turn this to you first, Amanda, and then Shauna.
Yeah, I feel like Shauna spoke to this a little bit, so I don't want to, I will say just briefly, I feel like it can be really confusing, it can be overwhelming, it can be shame-inducing. On the other hand, I feel like the majority of parents who come to me who have really accessed a lot of this, they're eager to learn and they're really open-minded and they're just looking for like, I understand this kind of, but can you help me tweak it and make it really apply to my kids? And I can do that with the parent, and then they're able to, in some ways, sometimes move more quickly because they have a foundation as long as they've been reading, good resources from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I could talk about this for so long. I'm pausing and taking a breath, see, pausing. This is actually what inspired a whole nother branch of our clinic, which was beyond just direct services, but doing parenting outreach and provider trainings and e-courses and such, was this just wave of families coming in with anxiety, self-doubt, and inconsistent parenting practices from that. Because in my observation in our clinic, what we saw was this, what we refer to as the positive parenting volcano, which is like this pressure to be Mary Poppins and Zen Master and all of this all the time. And if you just do that, if the relationship is safe enough and if you're a nice enough parent, then you will kumbaya it out. And so they try and they white knuckle it and they white luck it. And then the most positive, respectful, conscious parents, they blow up because it's too much pressure. It's too much. And so like even just naming that, I've had particularly moms break down into tears, right? So that's the biggest impact that I've seen, is that they tend to read extremes. Things that make great posts are things that tend to be flashy, not very nuanced, that say this practice is good, this practice is bad, do this, not that, do this, not that. And that is pushing parents to be feel like they have to be cookie cutter parents, which is, it doesn't respect neurodiversity. Some kids need different tools than others. It doesn't respect cultural diversity, right? Some cultures parent different than others. So, I'm a believer in evidence-based practice, and I have that as my foundation, that's my due north. And then, parents are yelling at each other on their paths up the mountain because of what they read on social media about like, well, this is the right respectful way and this is not.
And I'd like to answer this one too.
Yeah.
Mostly just to say, I completely agree with the other two people. And I realized as I was really resonating with you, Shauna, about the overwhelm that I see from parents, I've realized I've seen a different and a positive response sometimes in other settings. Like, I think that the sheer amount of parenting advice that's out there is shifting our culture. And I feel like that there are some pieces of parenting advice out there that are great pieces of parenting advice. And I see people who aren't even parents consuming this stuff and looking at their own childhood and saying, oh my gosh, I wish somebody had said that or done that or understood that for me. And so, although I think for parents as consumers, it's quickly overwhelming and confusing, I do also kind of like it. because I think that we're kind of disseminating some psychological concepts. Some of them are good out into the world, and I think it can have a positive impact.
I think it also has been normalizing for people that are struggling in a lot of ways too. So thank you for good reframe, Katie. Yeah, you know, I think it has been normalizing for a lot of people, like, oh, I'm not the only one struggling with this, right? It's normal to seek out help. It's normal to not know what to do. Lots of people don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Great points, everybody. So at this point, we'll move into the final thoughts segment of our webinar. So I want to give each of you a chance, if you have any final thoughts, anything we haven't talked about already today, you'd like to share with the audience, anything about yourself or your practice. So I will let Shauna go first, and then Katie, and then Amanda.
Sure. Oh, I haven't thought ahead about this one. I realized I didn't even say the name of our practice. It's Helping Families Thrive. We are on social media, on Instagram, my first time having an Instagram. So if you want to follow us for some evidence-based balanced parenting advice is kind of what we strive for. We also have a For Professionals tab on our website. We do a lot of professional training, providing CEs. We have a 6-module e-course on what the core components of the top evidence-based parenting practices are, that have video examples of kiddos using the skills, and we have clinicians that use that to guide their sessions. So the clinician will get trained in these practices, and then we'll have the family watch a module. They do it together, and then it has a workbook that goes with it. So if you don't have a lot of experience, you know, or your program didn't include training in an evidence-based practice, it's a summary there. It's a 6-hour course broken into 6 modules. And there's a discount code for professionals, interestingly called Simple. So if you enter Simple, you can do that and get the professional discount. Other than that, thank you for doing this work. I mean, working with parents you can interrupt so many generational cycles doing this work. It is so empowering for parents to know that early intervention is so powerful, and that the data supports it. You know, intervene early, and that what they do actually can totally shift the trajectory for their kids. So thank you.
Let's see, my final thoughts. I have 2 or 3. One is, I'll share my website. It's parenthoodunderstood.com, parenthoodunderstood.com. And there are different resources there, including the Arc of the Tantrum, if you want to get it there. One of the things that moved me from being a child and family therapist into specializing with parents on parenting was when I became a parent myself. And I felt like it kicked my butt. It's such a hard job, and I don't think there ever could be enough support for it. So I love the idea that there are 3,000 people on this call who want to support parents all over. I'm kind of thrilled with it. And I'll also tell you that I feel like that the work that we do with parents is how we change the world.
Yes.
I think every single time we help a parent from attunement and love and compassion and understanding, it's going to change the future, because what will it do for the world to have a whole generation of kids who grew up that way? So it's good work.
That's beautiful. I will share that my website is constructiveparenting.com. I do blog somewhat infrequently, but there are some resources there that if anyone's interested, you can have access to for free. I will say, you know, one piece of the work that I do with parents that we didn't talk about today is I will work with parents who want to go a step further beyond sort of just parent coaching kind of stuff, parent consultation, to really reparenting their inner child. And I have found internal family systems and somatic experiencing, and those are both modalities that I've been trained in, to be really helpful in that work. And so typically that means, you know, they're better able to pause when their kids are upset. They're better able to pause and do that U-turn and really understand what's going on with them and show themselves compassion and understanding. And then from there, they're able to reach their children a little bit differently and more authentically. Oh, you're on mute again, Jameson.
Thank you all so much for being here. Really beautiful thoughts. Sorry, I was still just emotional from everything Katie was saying over there. One last point I wanted to make is just mentioning that we have an upcoming CE webinar for Learning Live, which will be Parent-Child Conflict, Practical Interventions. So you'll all be receiving a follow-up email with both a recording of this webinar as well as some information on our other upcoming webinar if that's of interest to anyone. And then just lastly, wanted to thank all three of you again so much, and thank you to all of our participants for joining. It has been my absolute pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you so much.
Thank you, so fun.
Thank you.